still. Today I read psychology, theology, science, philosophy, sociology, all still trying to understand those questions that my high school self asked. How people are able to deny the basic humanity of others. Because it starts with that othering, and it leads to all sorts of things, from denying the right to vote, to denying citizenship, to denying equality, to denying marriage. It leads to domestic violence. It leads to gun violence. It leads ultimately to Holocaust. It's a long way, true, before you get from othering to Holocaust, but the path starts there with scapegoating, with denying humanity. How do we start that hardening of heart? So my path began with literature, with creativity, with the written word and the struggle for evil. I studied the Bible for answers, but the Bible ultimately was just a set of stories to me. It was a set of stories that were set out to answer those questions and others, and sometimes the answers were satisfactory. To some people, the answers are always satisfactory, but sometimes for me, the answers were not. For me, sometimes the Bible just led to more questions. If there is a loving God, then how do you explain what he did to Job? How do you explain the commandment to Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac and lead him to the point where he willingly binds up his son and prepares to kill him? How do you understand a God who would willingly and knowingly harden Pharaoh's heart, and then, because Pharaoh didn't let the Jews go, kill all the firstborn sons of Egypt? How do we worship that God? How do we worship the God of the flood? And ultimately, the more I understood, the more the greatest question loomed. How does God need Jesus to die on the cross? Why is suffering required for redemption? How can innocent suffering ever be a requirement with a loving God? Couldn't another way to salvation be found? What sort of cosmic horrible equation and what sort of limited powers of God could make that equation necessary? So once one decides that the stories of the Bible are just stories, and they can address some great questions, but their answers are not decisive, not definitive, something happens. And what happens for me is that the world of stories opens up, and that you find that all sorts of stories can hold answers for you as well. Why not, when thinking about the question of evil and redemption, consider whether the ultimate redemption of Darth Vader or the ultimate lack of redemption of Lord Voldemort is a more satisfactory literary ending and holds more truth for the plight of the human condition? Why not consider which one feels more right, which one says more about the nature of humanity and the nature of evil? For me, the most potent form of literature for exploring theological questions became science fiction, because science fiction, to me, had the most theology in it, ironically. Works that are more realistic can answer questions too. Certainly from Shakespeare to Hemingway, we are taught lessons through literature about the nature of humankind. But for me, taking it into the fantastical became a way of exploring the limits of ideas. What better way to understand what humanity is than to compare it to alien life? For example, in Star Trek, again and again, we come up against alien cultures, from Vulcans to Romulans to the Borg, and from each one we learn what makes humanity unique, what makes us special, what are the essential values of the nature of humanity. Often in Star Trek, the answer is emotion and free will. I wrote an article once about the religious values that I found in the Hunger Games. The passage I find most meaningful in the Hunger Games is where Katniss is meeting with Peeta before they go into the games to kill everyone, or to not kill everyone in their cases. And he says that he's trying to think of how he can be himself in that battlefield arena, how he can show them that they don't own me, as he says. He says, I want to die as myself. I thought, isn't that the struggle we all have? To die as ourselves, to be ourselves even in the most adverse of conditions, to be ourselves, our best selves when faced with a workplace which requires of us ways in which we kill our values one step at a time, to be ourselves in every little decision we make about the ways we pollute the earth or try not to. We're always trying to be ourselves and to show that this corrupt system with which we're faced every day as human beings doesn't own us and doesn't define us. In theological school once, I heard about story theology. And when I heard that term, I was so excited. Oh, someone gets it, story theology. Unfortunately, that's not what it meant. It was sort of like saying, through the stories of the Bible, you see God. But it was very specifically biblical only. But I believe we can use all sorts of stories as lenses through which to answer the big theological questions. It's not just story, of course. I mean, story is so important for me as someone who was devoted to literature for many years before theology, before theological school and ministry. But it's also music and art and dance and all sorts of ways to be creative, from building and architecture to gardening. So in music, which is another thing I turned to, from XTC's Dear God and REM's Losing My Religion to Depeche Mode's Blasphemous Rumors, which argued, I think that God's got a sick sense of humor, and when I die, I expect to find him laughing. To step back into Holocaust literature for a moment, there's another way that this literature took me down the path of my calling, and that's through calling me to write, by calling me into the impulse of the creative. After reading the diary of Anne Frank, I had a few dreams sprinkled throughout my life about Anne Frank. And the first one was in high school, probably during that class or shortly after it. In my dream, I met Anne Frank, and in childish words, she impressed upon me the importance of writing, the importance of me writing. It was a dream that would come back to me again and again, not in dream form, but in memory form, urging me to write, compelling me to write, reminding me to write. Over and over again, I would chide myself at my failure to produce a regular journal or to do the level of writing that I wished I would, and remind myself of Anne Frank, who never got to grow up, never got to be the writer that she could have been. Her writing was taken from her. There are actually dozens of examples of teenage journals of Holocaust victims, none of whom got to live their potential and share the writers they would have become as adults in this world. To the extent that I am a preacher, I'm a preacher because I was a writer first. And I was a writer first because of Anne Frank. And Anne Frank gave me the balance to that question of evil. And when I would get too deep into that question of man's inhumanity to man, humanity's inhumanity to humanity, I would remember her words, and I do still. For she said, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of confusion, misery, and death. I see the world gradually turned into a wilderness, and I hear the ever-approaching thunder which will destroy us too. I can feel the suffering of millions, and yet, if I look up into the heavens, I think it will come out all right, and that this cruelty will end, and that peace and tranquility will return again. In the meantime, I must uphold my ideals, for perhaps the time will come when I shall be able to carry them out. Words to live by. And these words were later echoed for me in the Unitarian Universalist theology of Theodore Parker, who would say, I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but a little ways, and I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure that it bends towards justice. So for a while, I followed the path of literature as an English major in college and in graduate school, looking in books for meaning, for guidance, for answers to those largest questions. In graduate school, I would study folklore, how folk tales are moral tales often, stories that we tell to illustrate our values, our morality to children and to adults. Cinderella was hardworking and devoted to her mother's memory. Beauty was self-sacrificing and demanding to be left with the beast and only asking for her father to bring her a rose, etc. And I began to look at the morality we're sharing in the stories we tell today, both those old tales and new ones, through urban dangers, how we warn about the world and its dangers. And as we know from last weekend's White House Correspondent Dinner, jokes are not just jokes. Sometimes they are about tearing something down. Sometimes they are about speaking truth to power. Jokes are like small oral narratives, small stories, repeated bits of micro stories that we tell for a specific purpose of comedy, but we tell them also for other purposes. Sometimes we tell them for racist purposes. Sometimes we tell them for sexist purposes. Sometimes we tell them to shatter the status quo. But if literature led me into the deepest theological questions, and it explored those questions well, it was poetry that called me back out and called me to action, called me into my calling. In poetry, I found the message that while it does matter what the cause of evil is and what the answer to evil is, there is one thing that is certainly the case, and that it requires of us action in this world. It requires of us to make our lives a force for good. And so in Christine Lohr Weber's poem, Mother Wisdom Speaks, she told me, the world needs the hollowness of you. You must be large, a passage. And Mary Oliver asked me, tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And she told me, when it's over, I want to say, all my life I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. Rebecca Parker told me, your gifts, whatever you discover them to be, can be used to bless or curse the world, and concluded, choose to bless the world. Lynn Unger said, make no mistake, of course your work will always matter. Rainer Maria Rilke said, you must change your life and want the change, be inspired by the flame, and pour yourself like a fountain. Rumi said, there is a community of the spirit, join it and feel the delight of walking in the noisy street and being the noise. Sonia Sanchez said in words that were put to music by Sweet Honey in the Rock, I say come and return to the fight, this fight for the earth, this fight for our children, this fight for life. We need your hurricane voices. We need your sacred hands. I say come, sister, brother, to the battlefield. Maya Angelou said, give birth again to the dream, women, children, men. Take it into the palm of your hands and mold it into the shape of your most private need. Sculpt it into the image of your most public self. And Adrienne Rich told me, I have to cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. In the Bible, Samuel was a boy, and God called to him. And Samuel thinks it is his master Eli and goes running to him. And Eli says, no, I didn't call you, sends him back to bed. And it happens a couple of times until Eli realizes it must be God and tells Samuel to answer him. And the next time Samuel does and is given more directions by God, Samuel becomes a prophet, one who hears the word of God and shares it with the world. I am no prophet. I don't hear the word of God calling me in the night, but I hear the calling of others, these voices that speak to me through poetry and literature and call me to pour my life like a fountain, to be ignited, to stay on the battlefield, to choose to bless the world. I am called not by God, but through poetry and story. No prophet, I have no extraordinary power, but a choice to bless the world and choose to reconstitute it, as do you. Use your choice, your creativity, whatever calls you into action, into your passion, and choose it to bless the world. May it be so.